Roger just said, I'm Elliot Chigger with Milrose Consultants. I'm a VP of Sales, been with the firm 14 years. I'm excited to be here with you all today. We're going to have a great panel discussion. Some great insight from some industry leaders with different perspectives into the real estate market, and specifically from the residential conversion, commercial to residential conversion, which has been a hot topic in New York City, not only 10, 15 years ago with the reuse of industrial buildings, but now even more so in the heart of New York City and the surrounding boroughs and country at large, converting office buildings, commercial office buildings that are either underused or underutilized, and converting them into residential. So the hope today is to do a bit of a deep dive into the current state of the market, the history of residential conversions, and maybe get some new insights into what could be coming through city legislation changes or changes in the market. So without further ado, I'll ask each of my panelists to just introduce themselves with a little bit of background on their professional background and what they bring to the table, and then we'll dive right into some questions. Please.
Hi, I'm John Harold Cicero. I'm a real estate attorney and partner at a real estate law firm, DL Partner, a big real estate firm in the city for about the last 30 years. We do a lot of commercial real estate, residential, commercial leasing, condo conversions, and obviously I have a lot of clients and developer clients that are very interested in the commercial to residential conversion, so we're getting involved in that heavily as well.
Hello, Eitan Solomon. I'm a structural engineer with Silliman T.Y. Lin. I've been there for 20 years and done a few large and small conversions, office to residential, and many other adaptive reuses. So I come at it from once the building is set to be converted, how do we actually do that with the physical materials that we have? Look at the original construction, look at what we can do for modifications, expansions, vertical additions, horizontal additions, if we have to carve up the building. So how do we make that happen from a structural, the bones of the building standpoint? That's what I look at.
Good morning, my name is Rob Holbrook. I sit at the Mayor's Office of Policy and Planning. I am trained as a planner and worked in the city for 20 years. As a planner, I'm getting better. I'm recovering, learning things slowly. You guys already know. I run the Office to Conversion Accelerator Program. Under the Mayor's Office, we provide concierge services to government for projects that are converting to office residential.
He's our friend.
Yes.
Adam Ralston. I run a studio, founding of a studio called Inc. Architecture and Design. We're a vertically integrated hybrid studio dedicated to the integration of the design disciplines from interior design to architecture. Our architecture work, and probably one of the reasons I'm here, it's been about 50-50 ground up and adaptive reuse conversion. And that has become such an important topic within the studio and with our clientele. So I'm really happy to be here and talk about this.
Thank you all. So to kick us off again, to take a step back, talking about the history. When did conversions start in the city and the surrounding boroughs? Why did they start? Was it a need for more residential units? Was it a lack of industrial use? Did the city change? So anyone, Adam, Bob, what are your?
I'd love to answer that question because I kind of started my career my experience in multifamily with a conversion. 60 Spring Street, down on Spring and Broadway. And I think when we think of the residential downtown loft conversion, that was kind of the first wave of this idea because there was less manufacturing and stuff like that. We think of big loft spaces, right? But the truth is, my first project, 60 Spring, was an office building. A 1918 one, but an office building nonetheless. Probably later than that, probably more like, maybe 1918. So in a funny way, this is not a new topic. And architects have been dealing with this tackling this for a long time. I think the problems now are very specific to the typology that's now empty. And that's kind of the point of it.
I would definitely say this is not a new experience. Time is inevitable. All buildings age, and economies change, and technology changes. So New York City has a long history of adaptive reuse in many ways. So a lot of our manufacturing buildings, loft buildings were originally printing presses that no longer need to be printing presses, and they turned into office buildings, and where we worked for a while, and now they're finding their third generation. So this is not particularly residential conversion was very prevalent in the 90s in Lower Manhattan. Obviously, so everyone has seen the huge transition of the use nature of Lower Manhattan. So this is not a new concept because of the post-COVID market for office.
Right, you mentioned the printing presses, like the Newswalk building. That was a prime example of an old building, old printing press, converted to residential, and arguably easier than doing it today. And the types of buildings, not only with zoning and the different navigating of city agencies to get through, but just the type of building. So I think that has really shifted the shifted the focus of residential conversions has shifted to different types of buildings. And I'd love to talk about, the current state of the market.
Was it easier to do longer ago? Has it gotten harder?
I think it's the typology shift that's
Just-
hard. I mean, going from industrial to office. I mean, our studio is literally an old printing space, right? Much easier when we did a zoning or like a filing switch, but the office to residential is trickier.
Yes, sir. And what are you seeing as the current state of the market? Are you seeing an uptick in, maybe John Harold, are you seeing clients reach out with a lot of interest in residential conversions?
I think there's more interest just because, as Rob will speak to, some of the new laws that are coming into play. There's the 45X, which has a tax exemption for a generous period of time for ground-up construction, but now for 467M for commercial to residential conversions, the period for comments just closed, so that's going to be something that's going to really push this movement forward for these commercial to residential conversions. And what the requirements are for 467M and the workbook and filing process similar to the old 421A program. So we're starting to get a lot of calls about people who are very interested in it, lenders who have borrowers that are interested in doing it that want us to do due diligence to see if it's feasible.
Eitan, what about yourself? When would you necessarily get a call on, is it feasible to do a residential conversion, or is it more, once the decision has been made that we're going to do it, that's what we call in the structure engineering?
I mean, sometimes it's earlier to assess feasibility before anyone else on the team is brought on. People want to see, well, can it be done? What are the implications? And like Adam alluded to, the typology is important. Like, I think you're alluding to the mid-century, very large block office building and how that's hard to convert to residential now because it doesn't meet like NAR requirements for residential. That's often the conundrum, and so we get called in to perhaps make a courtyard carve out, add that square footage to the top of the building or the side. So that's major surgery. It's someone once used the analogy that we're the orthopedic surgeons for once you decide to do that adaptive reuse of a body that's the building. But it really depends on the team in the building. Sometimes we're called in very early, sometimes after something is already developed.
It's funny you say that because I always tell people, guys, I'm in real estate and construction. I'm not performing heart surgery. No one's going to die on the table. But there you go. You're likening yourself to a cardiovascular surgeon here.
Regional down a little bit
Sure.
just to give a little more context for these guys. So, like, the typical apartment that you live in New York City is about 35, like from window to back of wall to front door is about 35 feet. The office buildings, the 60s office buildings that he's talking about, can be as deep as 50 feet. So that's the problem, is what do you do with that internal space that doesn't have light and air or access to light and air by code, driven by the city. So that's one problem, and you can picture like 6th Avenue as these pure extrusion blocks. They take up the whole block, they're massive. To convert those, that's tough, and those are now sort of considered Class B office space. Class A is completely rented, 90% occupancy over on the Hudson Yards, but those buildings are suffering, particularly if they're not in super nice neighborhoods. So what do you do with those? And I think that's one solution. The other one is the wedding cake type. Really deep, full block bases, you can picture them, they're limestone usually or something, and they set back. And I think there's an opportunity there, and the real hurdle that we found in doing feasibility studies, we were involved in 1740, which is one of those. And we've had 2 developers come at us for feasibility studies, and the problem is the really deep floor plate at the bottom, because it's zoned commercial. They would have to go to zoning to get it zoned commercial with residential above, because that lower floor plate isn't usable as residential. So that mixed use is a hurdle for developers. That's impossible. And they can go to the city, and I want you to disagree with me. So, and I'm literally sitting with one of my developers this week asking this question. He can get it past the city, but the minute it goes to the city, the neighborhood council or whatever it is, it gets killed.
Let's
Unpack
let's unpack that and let's talk about this. So, first quibble, the light and air easement requirements for the window is a state law, multiple dwelling law. You'll hear me refer to that as MDL. There's a special section in that 277 that was adopted in 1977 that allows for conversion of uses, but sets this minimum requirement for distance for a legal window. So that is a legal window. If you have a building that has a side lot line with an existing window on it, that is not a legal window, because you don't have control over how tall your neighbor's building is built eventually. So uses, that's no problem. You don't have to have legal windows, but under state law, residence uses has to have a window within 30 feet of a room.
Which is a good thing.
We can talk about that. I'm all right with that. Next, we have city zoning, which is a separate piece of legislation adopted by the city council under our zoning map and our zoning text. So there's two different pieces there. Under the zoning resolution, there's something called Article 1, Chapter 5, which is a section of the zoning resolution that provides more flexible rules for the conversion of existing commercial buildings to residential uses, with the understanding that these buildings are older, they're already there, so the sort of the height and limits of the new construction rules, guys go to explain things like that, shouldn't apply to a building that already exists and we're just adaptively reusing it. So that is a separate section of the zoning resolution established, I'm not sure when that was originally created, it might have been earlier 90s, that sets different ages for different neighborhoods in New York City to use those more flexible rules. And when I say more flexible, it means we can only go as low as flexible as state law, right? So however much floor area you have, if it is overbuilt at 18 FAR, and the zoning resolution only allows 12 FAR residential use or 8 FAR, Article 1, Chapter 5 allows you to convert all of that floor area, even if you're overbuilt. Right, so that section is currently in front of the City Council for amendment. Part of the City Housing Opportunity, which I hope everyone has heard about. Today would be a great day to tell your council member that you're in support of City Housing Opportunity. It's really important for all of us, not just for those of us converting, but anyone who lives or has friends or employees who live in New York City. It is extremely important. That is my cost of That's what I have to, I'm required to say that at all. And literally, it is in front of the city council members today. They are negotiating any amendments that they want to have out of it. Lots of coverage on that, so I don't mean to later. But one section of that is a change of the eligibility rules of that more flexible zoning resolution. Currently, there's a patchwork footwork. There was a task in 2023 that came up with a set of recommendations. That task force included council members, representatives, and government. And one of the recommendations was to change that eligibility rule from this weird quilt that was created based on when changes were made over time. Bring all of the city, everywhere, all of the geography of the city up to 1990 or older. We set that 1990 rule looking at the age of existing building stock, and there was a clear cut. At the 80s, there was a lot of production. There wasn't a whole lot in the 90s, so we needed to make lines. So we put the line at the end of the year.
So is that the answer to what my developer was saying about each?
Good trick. So there are two requirements. One is, does the envelope work for you? And the other one is the use allowed by zoning, right? So if you were in a manufacturing district, which there are some substantial manufacturing districts in Manhattan and places, you don't necessarily connect with a manufacturing industrial use. Manufacturing allows commercial or industrial uses. Commercial districts allow commercial or residential districts. So you have to have both a eligibility for the conversion rules of the text and a underlying map that allows residential uses. So there are mixed use districts, manufacturing residential, commercial districts, or residential districts. The next thing that the city is going to do in early next year is called the Midtown South rezoning, which is the last 4 substantial manufacturing only districts in Midtown, large blocks of the area. We're proposing to zone those on our own effort and dime to allow residential uses in a mixed use scenario. Those 2 council members have stood in good support of that proposal, and as well as the president, so I think there's a lot of political support. And this is part of a sort of larger move of Midtown to a mixed-use neighborhood rather than exclusively commercial. So there are other cultural and capital investments that go along with those changes. But that is, again, for next year. Right now we're working on this eligibility for all of those 1980 era buildings. The next will be 2 geographies. If you are in a manufacturing district in Brooklyn, say, and you have an older building of appropriate age so that you could take advantage of the rules, but you are in a manufacturing district, then you would need to pursue Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, ULURP, which is an extended legislative process. It takes on the books 9 months, but really takes 2 years. And yeah, there's a
for context, that ULURP trying to change the identification of the building is a 2-year process. But imagine a developer is not going to do that unless they have control over the property. So if they have control over the property, they're either paying financing charges or taxes on that property. So it's an expensive proposition to go through the ULURP process, which hinders development.
Which is one of the observations the task force made, that let's get these land use regulations that are archaic and no longer reasonable out of the way, and let the market decide which buildings are financially feasible for conversions and which ones aren't. That's a decision an owner or developer can make as long as they have the opportunity.
You use a lot of those catchphrases that historically in the industry, you're like, avoid a ULURP, avoid a Zelda, avoid a zoning text amendment, a zoning change, because It adds time, it adds money, and just find a site that works.
Yep.
But it sounds like through, Rob, your program, and I'd love to hear about the accelerator program, what it's intended to do, what's working, what its goals are, and how, everything that you're saying, is that kind of part of your accelerator program to push those initiatives with city council and with, city planning to make these sorts of changes, or how are you interacting with developers, architects, owners, and to make these projects work?
So keep in mind, we have a pretty robust bandwidth of conversion projects that are in flight today, right? Before, as we were doing this work to expand the eligibility, there are a handful of projects that are actually under construction right now. So that is my first job, is providing navigation and technical advice services about the permitting and approval process to those projects. It's an exercise in communication. We do not have a waiver of zoning rules, so if you are in a manufacturing district, you still have to go through the process. If you're getting a building permit, you still have to get a building permit and meet with the requirements for building permit. But we can help with communication. So sort of 3 buckets of projects. There are those that are in a diligence design process, where you are trying to figure out what is the right floor plan for this conversion project, so that we can project income for a future residential scenario and compare that to current code. So that's a lot of analysis and decisions that need to be made on the developer's part that require a lot of noodling. And there are sometimes very complicated questions, like their requirements. Every building is unique, so when you were trying to set out a residential layout, where your doors and kitchens and penetrations are going to land to provide sort of the right vent stacks, is a complicated engineering process that has a structural analysis piece of it, because you're coring through an existing floor plan. So there's a lot of analysis that has to happen in the beginning of that part, and I strongly encourage that. The one lesson I've learned is the more money you spend on diligence and investigation, the easier, the less likely you're going to fuck up in the process later. So it's very important. And it is a hard lesson to learn when you're coming out of new construction, where all of the risk is in the dirt. Here, all of the risk is when you open up the wet walls and find something that you didn't expect to find. So diligence bucket, and then there are some projects that are going through rezonings, that are going through a landmark approval because it is a protected building, or a planning commission. There's actually planning commission authorizations that we're still in process. So that's sort of a slow burn. Some of these can take a year as well, 6 months. And then finally we get into the construction grades, where they're calling, we need to close a lane R, and you talk to DOT about getting a lane closure.
But you're an advocate for the project.
Again, it's communication.
Right.
If the DOT says no, that is great. You can't close it tomorrow. You better reschedule your concrete, and that is the answer. So sometimes, we're not going to twist their arm. They get a different answer than what they want, but we can't say, hey, you need to respond to this.
Let me start one stat just to help context in terms of how you were saying how many or how many now. So national, over the last 2 years, there were 41 office to residential conversions. Slated and filed and active for next year, there's 200. So that gives you a little bit of context of why this conversation is happening.
I've got some city numbers. We did last decade, we did 4,000 unit production through conversion. Our goal is 20,000 over the next 10 years. We're certainly on 2,000 under CFO this year, and 2,000 next year, probably more after that.
And next year nationally, 20,000.
I just want to say the importance of what they're doing with the rezoning to help developers to circumvent that whole ULURP process. It changes, there's a domino effect to it, because I'll see from my perspective as the attorney, the REITs and publicly traded companies and private equity funds, they'll come in sometimes and they'll be willing to sit through that process, eat those carrying costs, and do a project where they're going through the ULURP process and the rezoning, where family offices, historic New York real estate families and other investors and developers who are a little bit smaller scale, they want to do those projects, but they won't take on that huge hurdle and headache and cost and expense of time and money. So that rezoning has a tremendous effect in who's going to have an eye on the neighborhood, and having a New York-based investor, developer, real estate family versus a national publicly traded company that's in New York, out of New York, in other areas. It changes how the neighborhood develops over time.
The levels of playing field as well allows others to join the party.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about New York City, and obviously we always say if you can do it here, you can do it anywhere. But Eitan or Adam, what are you seeing outside of New York? Have you worked on projects, residential conversions outside of the New York metro area? Is it easier? Are the building types different? What does that look like?
Yeah, like you alluded to convert an existing building, you have to know what the original construction was. Otherwise, you're going to find lots of problems in construction. So running with the body analogy, you want to do your x-rays, your blood tests and all that. What that means in reality is doing probes, opening up the finishes to see the construction, looking for existing drawings, which can save thousands and thousands of dollars on probe work, geotechnical investigations. These all have analogy in like, the doctor operating on the patient. But so there were a lot of trends throughout the country for construction type, from early 1900s masonry and wood, transitioning to steel and concrete construction, and then post-war was just a huge palette of new technologies that people use. And that's throughout the country, not just New York City.
So our most exciting work right now is outside of the city, precisely because it's so hard for developers in New York City. We're working with New York City developers across the country. Two most exciting projects. One is literally, they call it the Empire State Building in Pittsburgh. 35-story tower, beautiful limestone building, deco, gorgeous. And this is the interesting part. It's being converted into what I'm calling a vertical village, in the sense that it's hyper mixed use. It's not just office and residential, it's office, residential, private club, health club, bars and restaurants, and a grocery store. And it combines both hotel and branded residences that are rental, so transient rental. So it's literally a vertical village. It's a little economy in and of itself. So you go from having, in that building, it was a sort of 2,000 person population during the day only, to an approximately a similar amount of population going through the building in the course of a single day, 24/7. Imagine what that will do for our central business districts. That's just liveliness. It's body heat. And that was only possible because downtown Pittsburgh doesn't have these very specific and restrictive zoning requirements that you can mix rental, residential, hotel, restaurant, grocery store all in one building. We're doing a similar one in Phoenix. Again, a gorgeous building that's the 1960s, this kind of Oscar Niemeyer, Jetson modernism thing in the middle of Midtown Phoenix. Same idea, with a kind of self-contained village, which I think is an amazing model. And could be, a model not just, obviously these projects are sort of middle to upper middle class properties. This could be an amazing model for low-income housing, creating new rich communities within our urban environments, particularly in buildings that are no longer usable, which becomes a sustainability proposition, right? Circular economy, reusing our urban resources as a kind of natural resource. Sorry, that was very...
That was good.
This is like our thing. Right?
Talking like a planner.
Yeah, exactly.
You may not find that concept usable in Midtown Manhattan, but to your point, right, low-income housing, some outer boroughs, or where you want to have a contained community within one building.
I disagree. I think in New York City it would be amazing.
I strongly disagree. That is
Let's do it.
the impetus of the New York panel, which was set up about a year ago. They have a series of 21 recommendations to sort of bring Midtown Manhattan into that mixed-use live-work environment. And again, like I said, there are open space requirements. The open space needs of a purely commercial strip where people leave at 5 o'clock is different from a 24/7 mixed-use neighborhood. So there's lots of different things that need to happen. It's going to be organic over time, much in the same way that Fidei was over 20 years.
Yep,
right? We
that's
started
a good
that
example,
conversion back in the 90s. One of these conversion projects, One Wall Street, now has a Whole Foods in that building. So that is just the perfect description of a change of a market over time. As residential people come in as first movers, they have needs that may be different from a larger family that comes in later. But as that change happens, the market comes with it.
Oh, very interesting. All right, so we've spoken a lot about the challenges, the residential mixed with commercial uses, the floor area, legal lot, light and air. And then you mentioned Article 1, Chapter 5 that speaks about specifically how to loosen some of the restrictions there. So something like home occupation, that typically would only be X amount of square footage within your residential unit, could be mechanically ventilated instead of having legal light and airs if you had a home office. What does that Article 1, Chapter 5 do to a section like that, or a section like lot line windows that allows you some leeway in getting a larger home office, which is becoming more and more common post-COVID days, co-living, co-working, and live-work balance. What does that look like? Are those kind of helping developers and residential tenants, want to take an apartment that has this kind of stuff?
Sure, it's something we see a lot, and I think some of our design professionals are very creative with. Home office is a defined term in the zoning resolution. It's actually not in Article 1.5, it's somewhere else. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and the stacking rule as well. So part of the complication is we've been doing multiple city of yes zoning changes. The second one, city of yes for economic opportunity, really talks structuring our entire commercial zoning districts. One of those changes was home office. Prior to CDS economic opportunity, the rule was 400 square feet maximum for home office. It was no more than a quarter of the apartment.
25%.
Yep. So now on the books and approved, we've changed that from 400 feet to 1,000 square feet. There's other nuances there. You should look it up.
I think it's 49% now.
Yeah, change the percentage. But yeah, so beyond that 30 feet of light access, you can have a home office. Should not be marketed as a extra bedroom. Cannot have a ensuite.
Which is the problem.
Cannot have an ensuite. Cannot have a closet. Otherwise, that is a bit messed up. But
it looks like a duck and it sounds like a duck.
we're going to call it a duck eventually. But as long as you do not condemn yourself by trying to market it later as an extra bedroom. I have seen studio with a home office on them, which is kosher and fine, not a duck, as long as you market it that way. And yeah, so that is an easy solution. The other thing I wanted to mention in community, which is already on the books, stacking rule. We talked about mixed buildings. So there used to be what's called the stacking rule, which in New York City said you could not locate commercial uses above residential uses. That is no longer in effect. There are some leftover remnants on restaurants, but for the most part, you can now stack vertically, or you can mix a building horizontally if you want to cut out that core for storage uses or some other economically viable use. Life sciences are really interesting, the idea of like a commercial core. You do have to have separate lobbies, so that is a question. One of the upsides of that stacking rule is flexibility. You haven't really talked about tenancy and the difficulties of conversion based on when an owner's existing tenants still have long-term leases on the project. So that can be a gating issue if you have a single floor or 2 floors of a long-term tenant who has another 5 years on his lease. You have to either buy them out or wait them out. So that is an issue. One of the ideas of the second law is you can do these mixes now, so you can leave a commercial tenant in place and convert around them. There had been some history before that. It always had to happen from the top down. Now we're allowing that to go in different areas. It's still not easy because you have an occupied building. You have to keep your electricity on.
Sure. And these ones you're just talking about are already legislated, or they're part of this new?
So there's 2 I just talked about: the stacking rule and the home office expansion are already on place on the books available today.
As of
June.
Nice.
Right, so if you've got a building that's got 40 floors of offices and those top 10 floors are long-term lease commercial tenants, but the building is, the owner of the building wants to convert to residential and doesn't want to wait those additional 10 years for those 10 floors of leases to come due, they can convert floors 2 through 30 to residential, which was typically not allowed, right? You can't have commercial tenants coming down in the same stairs that residential tenants were coming in, so you always had to have residential above the commercial, residential above the hotel, and then the commercial base. That was the typical tower, right? It was condos above, a hotel if you want in the middle, and then the commercial retail base. Now you can kind of carve it up any which way you want, and even have as Rob alluded to, on the same floor, divided by a core, right? You have a core, one side is residential, the other side is commercial. The new, the Article 1, Chapter 5 allows for that, which is a tremendous help to developers who don't want to wait until it's too late to convert the whole building. They don't want to miss the boat.
Tenancy is a big deal. A lot of the projects we see converted are headquarters, where there was a single tenant in the entire building. They were moving out at a known date, or at least the leases were up for renewal at a low date. That's also sort of a New York versus outside of New York question. Is most of these I don't mean to ask aspersions about the rest of the world, but they only have headquarters office buildings. They don't have sort of mixed.
And John Harold, one of the other things that I've seen with kind of a way of working around some of the zoning concerns of like legal light and air is kind of a shared or common zoning law being created. Have you dealt with any of that? Have you acted as counsel on creating a larger zoning lot amongst, say, many different tax lots that then allow for light and air to be used from windows that would otherwise have been a lot line condition?
Right. Our firm, the only thing we don't do in real estate is zoning and land use. However, we work with zoning attorneys. We have done those projects. I've done a lot of ground-up development condominium projects where in order to get get light and air. We've bought the air rights on neighboring buildings and created a zoning lot so that what would have become lot line windows on a cantilever over a shorter neighboring building are no longer lot line windows, they're protected. So we have certainly done that, but I did want to quickly chime in as part of what you guys were discussing, one about creating affordability in Manhattan, in this area, and then also with regard to tenancies. And the tenancy issue is part of 467M allows you to convert not just the whole building, but portions of the building from commercial to residential, and there is an affordability aspect in that conversion where 25% of the units need to be rent stabilized in perpetuity, but the real estate tax exemptions and abatements make it much easier to pencil those projects now than they have been for a long time. And it's similar to 485X, which is ground up construction, not a conversion, but has a similar basis where you're going to have 20% of the units that you create are going to become rent stabilized in perpetuity, but you're looking at significant long-term real estate tax exemptions and abatement periods.
I promise we'll get to taxes in a minute. I do want to touch on the zoning lot mergers. So here's around the term ZELDA, zoning lot development agreement. It's very common in New York City. All of 57th Street, all of those towers were built on ZELDAs, where these transfers of floor area is a private contract between two separate property owners. It's an agreement on how to distribute zoning rights throughout those two property owners. And when you come to us, the city, we don't see the property line anymore. We treat it as if it was one lot, and so there's lots more flexibility, both with the lot line area as well as how you distribute. So that is a solid solution for how to deal with some of these side lot lines. It does require some sort of consensual agreement between two owners, and there's a price involved in that. Even if no movement of development rights, you still have to have a willing party. So there are a couple of other options I want to flag on for the lot line issues. There is a BSA variance, a BSA waiver of MDL requirements where the intent and equivalency of the light and air is established in some way. So there was a recent project, this BSA, it's called Section 310 of the MDL on a park. So if there's a park across next to your lot line, no one's going to build a building blocking those windows, so you can go to the BSA saying like it's the same as if it were on a street. They can grant that. Same as there are some, you can purchase a light and air easement, which is not as involved as a ZELDA. You're not sort of merging zoning lots, you're just purchasing an agreement not to build in that area and go to BSA and theoretically get that waiver of the lot lines. That is the thing we're starting to see coming in and talking about. So I'm going to take too much time to talk about 467M because we are very, very excited about it. So I would characterize most of these projects as high-end markets, high-end product, very expensively involved because you are doing open heart surgery in a building. So in order to meet that capitalization, all of these projects have been highly monetized, expensive apartment buildings. We are very excited in the city of New York with our partners at the state. Were authorized through last budget cycle to create a tax abatement program to get affordability out of these conversion projects. So 467M grants allows us to create a program that in exchange for 25% of income restricted in perpetuity, we will abate your taxes for a period of time. In Manhattan, that is up to 90%, 3 years of construction period at 100%, and then outside Manhattan, I would say 60%. So there's different areas, different markets. But the idea is there's a significant financial upside in the front end in exchange for a long-term affordability requirement. Those 25% of your units have to be marketed through HPD to an average income of 80% AMI. Rough numbers, think of it as $8,000 per year income for the household. One of those bands is at 40% AMI, so 5% of units at 40% and 20% something else. So that's really game-changing. We've got a lot of incoming excitement about people asking us to hurry up and establish this program. If you think about the idea of 40% AMI household, which is really like 2 retail workers in their 20s and 30s, having an apartment that they can access on Wall Street, that is a huge game changer for any neighborhood. So we're really, really excited about this as a change in the entire market of how these projects are created and how these neighborhoods are created. Because that's just something the market would never be able to provide on its own.
And to expand on that, there's certain, in the application process, you have to have a certain amount of affordable units on certain floors. You can't have more than 30% affordable on any particular floor. It can't just be on the lower floors. You got to integrate it throughout the buildings. There's no corridor, which was a huge issue on prior projects years ago. I'm sure everybody heard about that in the New York Post. It's got to be common entry for all. And then in Manhattan, it's 96th Street and below. And the rest of the city in 96th Street and above have different exemptions. It is based on where the project's located and when you pull the permits and your completion. I did a quick broad stroke summary of what the project 7M procedure is and what it requires. And I made a nice little chart on the back that will show you what the exemption and abatement periods are for the different projects in different areas. I took this right off HPD.
Where can we get those?
I left it right there on that page.
I'm getting one right now.
So that you have a quick reference guide, of course.
We intentionally created a motivation, let's call it. It becomes progressively less generous over time. This sort of does two things. It gives some impetus to people who are on the fence to make a decision quickly, and it sort of establishes, use it or lose it, and it doesn't necessarily accrue directly to the land value because it's not going to be there forever. So the impetus there is to try to create value to people who are actually in the process, not necessarily to just buoy the
Land ownership.
They're all going to look the same. So on schedule, we just had a hearing on the draft rules, which were released maybe about a month ago, a little bit more than a month ago. We got good comments back from a couple of developers and representatives on the draft rules. Our process is we're going to have to publish in the city record the final rules if there are any adjustments, and it takes 30 days before that becomes effective. At that point, we can take the application and start the lottery process for those projects. In the meantime, we are accepting draft workbooks. If you have a project who wants to come start talking to us, we can have an informal chat. I would add that as soon as you file your workbook, that's where it sets the AMI levels. We're accepting drafts without the formal requirement, in case you want to wait a year. So
I will say now that the comment period is over, in the last week we've gotten a number of calls from people who are looking to start drafting their workbooks that we've been retained to help them with the process.
And that's very good for us because when it goes to him, then it comes to the architects.
and by the time we get a workbook, we need a unit layout. We need like which ones are one bedrooms, which ones are two bedrooms, because they have different breakdowns. So that's what we set up.
I want to unpack one thing you mentioned. It doesn't always have to be open heart surgery.
That's true.
The live load for commercial is going to get a little technical, 50 pounds per square foot, and residential is actually only 40. So if you can do the project that's only converting areas, there's actually almost no structural work that's necessarily needed. It's only when you get into carving up the building for outdoor amenity spaces, that's the real heavyweight for us structurally, because historic roofs were almost never designed for crowds of people or pavers. That just like the basic snow load was actually very low compared to outdoor occupancy now. That's where it gets into
and so a lot of the sort of 1910s, 1920s buildings that are sort of masonry corner lots that have less than 40 feet deep on a corner lot, that's an easy conversion for a single load corridor on a lot line, and then you have windows that we're going to use. There have been a number of those, and hopefully the Midtown South rezoning, which will allow that residential allowance, will make those really easy. I do want to add on the rooftop recreation space. The other change in City US Housing Opportunity is to change the Article 1, Section 5 recreational space requirement, which used to be you had to put it on your roof, it had to be open to the sky, and it was basically a square footage project. Very, very few projects have ever been successful in meeting that requirement, so there was a sort of an on-starting joke as we set up the requirement and set up a waiver that you almost always had to go through. So recognizing that that was not reasonable, we're converting that rooftop open space requirement into consistent with the rest of New York City's quality housing recreation spaces. Anything interior can be used for the recreation space. So actually, hopefully, be away from that.
People will still want to go have a rooftop space.
Happy to have it. I just don't have to have trees on top of it.
The trees you don't have to occupy by more than 75 people and end up needing a place of assembly lab up there. Right? That always becomes tricky. That's when you get involved. 100 pounds per square foot roof that was 20. Right. So a little tough. You brought up the kind of the finances of this all, and I wonder, what factors go into, from an architectural standpoint, structural standpoint, the law side of things, when it makes sense to do a conversion versus a tear down, when that conversion makes sense to be a rental versus a condo. In my mind, like, you're going to spend all this money and turn it into a rental, you're never going to make money back on it. But it sounds like that's not the case. And it sounds like these projects can work both for rentals, they can work for condos and co-ops. But what is that tipping point from a structural feasibility standpoint, from an architectural standpoint, from just a brass tax standpoint? Like, when does it make sense to tear your building down and rebuild it? Maybe it's money, not everyone can do that, not everyone's JP Morgan Chase, or Citadel, or whomever, but like how does a developer, an owner, kind of decide the type of project and what to do with the building that they have?
He's going to be the best answer.
Yeah, well, I'll say initially, a long period of time, a lot of my clients, condo was really the only option. It just didn't pencil out as rentals. In order to go to the city and get variances, people, city council members, and whoever else would come back and say, we want some kind of affordability here. My clients, for the most part, weren't willing to go that route because it just wasn't economically feasible for the project. So for a long time, condominium conversions of existing buildings was the way to go, and I've done a ton of condo conversions in the last 10 years at least, and a lot of ground-up construction. But now you've got Local Law 67, the carbon emission, zero emission program over the next, I forget how many years that we've got. 25th, right. So there's thresholds where every 5-year period you have to have your carbon emission reduced, which means updating mechanical systems. So, and other factors of the building. So I've had clients look at these projects in Midtown and say, this is a phenomenal location, it's a great building, but by the time I gut the whole thing out, I have to change the windows, I have to change all the mechanicals, the floor plate doesn't work for light and air and other issues. It's cheaper to just tear this entire building down and build something else. And the problem is a lot of the existing owners of those buildings, they're not looking to sell at a fire sale price. They still own those buildings and want to see what other options are out there or hold on for better options. And that's where the rental finally, with some of these other programs like 467M, is a perfect example. It makes rentals feasible because now you eliminate one of the largest carrying costs that any property owner has, which is real estate taxes. You're getting an exemption period for the 3 years while you're doing the conversion and construction, and then a abatement that phases out over time, but really gives you the ability to do the conversion of the property and lease it up, and the majority of the building is going to be market rate.
Well, you brought up local regarding gas emissions, so local law 97 is where my head goes. And I know that certain building types come into compliance or need for compliance by certain years. First it's industrial, then it's commercial, and there are some waivers or leniencies for mission critical buildings and hospitals and things like that. But is there a kind of a play there that converting your building from commercial to residential may buy you some time in your compliance?
I think your baseline, the averages that you're being weighed against will be different for commercial buildings.
Got it. Okay, so it's not a timing thing, but it's right. What your bars are set lower or different.
One thing I can say with certainty is due to the escalation of costs, it would always be cheaper to do your upgrades now.
Correct. Right. Not right.
In 2029, it would be a bad year to be doing retrofits. Back to condo and rental. A lot of these projects are rental because it's just an untapped, endless, bottomless market. But also, some of them have gone condo recently or in the process. I may be a little weird about naming projects because I give a confidentiality expectation to owners who are talking to me, and I don't try to name names.
We'll talk about historic ones that have already been names.
I know somebody who is converting to condo, and it has a design implication because just the market for a larger floor plan condo is a better design solution for them to have less corridors that then lose sort of valuable marketable space. So by being able to cut a floor plan up into 2 condos rather than 10 apartments, they can just make it work better. So that is a design consideration. And again, you're looking also at where is the building located? Is it in a place where large families are likely to want to live in a large condo, or is it somewhere where you're looking at sort of trying to fill it with a bunch of bankers or something like that who are younger and maybe can take some apartments? So that's a design consideration that's really interesting, and everybody should think about that. Also, one thing I wanted to add on earlier reference on structural analysis is you mentioned that a lot of these developers are cutting cores. They can preserve that floor area as they demolish part of their building and add additional floors onto the top of the building. That makes things really hard and complicated. He likes it because he gets paid for it. But putting 4 stories on top of a building that was built in 1960, whatever, is a bit of a head scratcher. So there are code requirements that if you are adding a certain size space to your building, you have to look at different loading requirements. It can be really, really expensive too. That can be a game changer in the numbers. So as these sort of design professionals are working with each other on both sides of me. You think about what's the unit layout, where can we cut corridors? If we have a corridor, we have unused floor area, what are we going to do with that? Does it make sense to put it on top as it triggers all of the structural costs? Or do we just cut the core so that we can have leasable space on the inside and then let that go? Revisit the value of that floor area. Most of these buildings are overbuilt, right? So if you tear it down and rebuild it, you can only build what is allowed by the underlying zoning district on new construction. So that's sort of one of this analysis is how much overbuilt is your building? Does that make sense to do a preservation? You have to cover the cost of structural work.
Rob, does the city celebrate Roman City Hall in general? Do they? What is their kind of take on obviously you have a celebrate program that's designed to help these types of projects, but does the city prefer these to commercial projects? Is it neither here nor there? They just have to see development in New York.
Our job is to get regulation out of the way and make the processes easier and let the market decide which is financially feasible or not. We have similar programs to support commercial upgrades from B to A. If there is an owner who is, thinks that they have a viable plan for an upgrade, that's great. We don't think so. More numbers in New York City. We have about 500 million square feet of office space. In pre-pandemic, there was a 10% vacancy rate that is pretty flat and standard, and that's healthy vacancy where people can move around in their needs. And that vacancy is not consistent, as you said. Hudson Yards, very low vacancy rate. Over this neighborhood, a lot higher. But generally, 10% is healthy. Post-pandemic, we're looking at 20%. So that's an extra 10%, which comes out at like 20 million square feet. So that is a lot of vacant open space that needs to find a future use. Some of that will be in conversion, not all of that will be, and some of it will be in teardowns, and that is not horrible.
Right.
There are other solutions. Life sciences have been taking out and converting some of those buildings into lab space, which is great.
Those have their own challenges.
They have their own challenges, and they're also a success.
I just want to qualify that not horrible, because that is not a sustainable approach. And Europe's been addressing this. I mean, at some point, at the end of the line, a building has to be torn down, right? So what do you do with it? And the World Bank has financed studies. The EU has developed what is called material banking, which is you literally tear down the building, you separate the materials, and you store it. It becomes a natural resource that can be then fed back into the construction industry. And specifically in the realm of concrete, I think we all know that concrete is the biggest devourer or creator of CO2 on the planet, one of the biggest, at least in the construction industry. So concrete is actually very recyclable, and there are now, in the US, concrete manufacturers that are using recycled concrete within the sort of admixture. So it is the end of the line. Anybody who is invested in sustainability in our industry would say tear down is the last resort, but once it's there is, and I do want to say that, we do a lot of government hating these days. I will say that everything we've been talking about, even though it's slow and complicated, this is government at its best, particularly from my perspective, watching the industry struggle with the problems and then seeing government start to tackle it. So I think in the context of global warming and sustainability in our industry, there is the potential for legislation that could create material banks out of New York City buildings.
I don't know if you were claiming this, Adam, but I don't think there is a necessarily end of life of a building. I think it can constantly be used if it's maintained, if there are repairs done. There's people sometimes talk about 50-year life or 20-year life or 100-year life, but I think with the right attitude, you can keep reusing a building.
Hey, they need shipwrecks at the coral reefs. Maybe we'll do something like that here in City Building.
And not
attitude in deep pockets helps a lot.
Sure, right. I mean, to a certain extent, right, you don't want to see buildings torn down, but sometimes you get a great building in this place that'll last for the next 100 years and make the community and the environment better. So, it's interesting to hear you say, from a sustainability and environmental, I'd be interested to know, other than, just the CO2 emissions that come from concrete, are there any other considerations from a sustainability standpoint that go into a decision of whether or not, is a residential building more sustainable and more energy, conscious than a commercial building? Is there, is it better for the environment to have a residential building or a commercial building?
I mean, from my perspective, a little bit one of my obsessions, this idea of vertical villages. Mixed use is more sustainable. 90% of our urban footprint is in commute. So our urban carbon footprint. So the more we can create genuine neighborhoods out of our buildings and out of our city, the better it is from a perspective. It also, solves crime. When you have genuine, healthy, vibrant communities, that's when crime goes down. It's that simple.
There are lots of social benefits for converting to a mixed-use neighborhood rather than an exclusively segregated neighborhoods. I mean, we talk about transportation. People want to live near where they work. There is a huge desire for people who work in Manhattan to live near Manhattan to reduce their transportation time. So, from a policy perspective, it's good to give people the choice that they want to make rather than forcing them to live in Brooklyn and possibly displacing people who live in Brooklyn from their neighborhoods where you have that new construction.
Sure, yeah, you'll even see a lot of the smaller tech firms. These people come over from Silicon Valley and they'll give you a rent incentive to live within 10 blocks of the office. They'll do your dry cleaning for you instead of you having to send it out somewhere. So they're obviously that is the kind of the way of the future is like let's figure out how to be more sustainable and environmentally friendly. And I think to your point, these vertical villages is a fantastic way. And I'm glad to hear they really think it could work anywhere.
And
right.
Generally, not to generalize, but public is generally more comfortable with an existing building than a new building, or at least a fear of a new building and what it may change their neighborhood. So these conversions can often be politically popular because people are comfortable with neighborhoods. And also, 200 office buildings in the city are landmarked preservation requirements, so you can't get it at that.
Right.
So you got to find a use for it.
On my way out here after getting coffee at Starbucks, I was walking up the street up Lex, and I was looking up at ODA's new building, and some guy just randomly yelled at me, like saying, "That new building, it's been going under construction for 6 years." So,
and maybe for a conversion, you don't need a sidewalk bridge, right? Keep it all internal. You do.
Definitely need
you definitely do, but you can't avoid that. The urban canopy program will at least make it look nice, right? Are there any specific projects that you guys think were successes or failures for any given reason that you may want to talk about openly?
I'm always proud of an early project in my career. This was almost 20 years ago. 110 Livingston in downtown Brooklyn. Two Trees was the developer. We did the open heart surgery, carve out, added floors to the existing building. But we were able to preserve this McKim Mead and White, very historic or somewhat historic building, and preserve that look of the neighborhood. So I thought that was a nice balance between doing that major work, providing a lot more residential units from what was a Board of Education building. Before that, it was an Elks Lodge. It had this great history, so it's nice to preserve that. And I think what I want to point out is we had to do very little foundation work because we could do, I don't want to get into all the details, but like a sort of much softer touch than new foundations would be, and must have saved millions of dollars on that cost. So it walked this tightrope of sustainability, doing big work, but also I think doing the right work for the neighborhood.
That's really great. All right, so then my last question before we take some questions will be for each of you, and we'll go down the row. What do you see the future as? I know you mentioned there, the goal is 20,000, units, or was it units or projects?
Units.
20,000 units, quite a bit. But and nationally they've got some goals. But what are we seeing as kind of the future of this conversion market? Are there any upcoming legislation like we've discussed that will definitely make it easier? Tax incentives, financial packaging loans that might help. So why don't we start with you, John Harold? What are you seeing as the future of the next 2 to 10 years?
I will say, for a long time, 421A was a great incentive for new construction in the city. 421A is somewhat dead and gone at this point, so there was a gap that needed to be filled. And as we all know, if you live and work in New York, affordability is a constant theme because a lot of people are getting priced out of the neighborhoods that they had lived in for a long time. I represent a lot of condo and co-op boards throughout the city as well, and I see it with people who have lived in buildings for 30, 40 years, and the neighborhood has grown exponentially during that time, and now it's very expensive. Common charges, real estate taxes, and people don't want to leave where they've been for a long period of time. So I think the ability to have the build rental projects, whether ground up through 45X or the conversions through 467M and whatever else follows it, that will create affordable housing in perpetuity in areas throughout the city, in Manhattan and the outer boroughs, but also make it feasible for developers and investors and with the zoning of certain districts, level the playing field for a lot of investors and developers who are maybe on the lower end to get into the game. I think it's only going to be positive things going forward, and as we see all the time, one program will lead to something else, we'll learn lessons from it, and that will be expanded upon in a future amendment or another program down the road, and it'll go from there. I won't name the name because everyone will know it, but I have a client who's very well known for big developer, does a lot of reuse programs, and they're doing something phenomenal right now that I'm working on with them, and I think it's going to change the neighborhood, and the fact that once it's announced that they're in that area, I think it's going to bring other people in, and I think with the programs that are available now, it's really going to be something else. And again, to my earlier point, you're going to get local developers and investors, not just national, who will come in and have been in these neighborhoods and markets for a long time, will have a different view of what they want to see the neighborhood become in the future than somebody who's a national player who comes in and out of different cities. And I think it'll be great for the character of the conversions and the feel of those neighborhoods long term.
That's great. Thank you. One thing I'll add to my question for you to kind of wrap up where you see this is, with all the kind of incentives and the changes to legislation that is making it easier to convert without doing the open heart surgery, what does the future look like for you? Is it less structural engineering to get these done, or are these projects still prime for?
It's probably a diversity of projects, and I'd love for projects to go forward and not need us, but there's going to be that spectrum of complication.
Sure.
Yes, amplify that playing field is so important on the market. And one of the things that I really look forward to as we talk about these changes, more players on the field. We covered that there have been a lot of these projects in New York City. They've typically been people who are highly confident in what they do. They know their product, they know their market, they know all of these structural complications because they've done it 4 or 5 times before. They're big players, big names. They may have a large inventory of commercial spaces so they can move tenants around, makes things easier for them. I think one of the things I'm really excited about is this, both the tax incentive and the geography expanding into Brooklyn and different buildings really creates a different product and profile that may not be sort of these highly amenitized high-end units, but are more appropriate in these secondary markets that are just as important. You still need to find a adaptive reuse rather than a tear down program. So that's something I'm really interested in, making new teams, new design professionals, connecting with new owners and who may not have been experienced in that. And the other thing I would add is I find that capital follows confidence, and as sort of this story and narrative is shared amongst developers, they tend to follow each other. So a lot of people who are on the fence or struggling whether to make a decision to recapitalize their units or not. A lot of the lenders are running out of patience on some underwater units, and so I think that there might be a decision-making process faster as a lot of these narratives. To be clear, we haven't launched our tax incentive program. Everyone's waiting on us to take action, and we feel that very much. The zoning action took 2 years for us to get through, so we have to make these slow government changes in order for the market to respond. Typically, it responds very quickly.
And seeing that exodus out of the city after COVID, really was painful to all these true New Yorkers who are like, this is where it is. This is where we need to be. And I think all these incentives will show people again that invite people back in. This is where you want to live. This is where you want to go. So I think it's really great. Adam rounds out.
This is sort of the opposite narrative that happened in the 70s. It's a boom loop, not a doom loop.
Right.
I mean, for me, it's hyper mixed use development. This idea of vertical village is something that we're very invested in. But the baseline of hyper mixed use development is understanding the relationship between the private sector and the public sector, and that as a collaboration. So just to give you a really concrete example, hyper mixed use development means really artful programming, having the right kind of services related to a large urban impact building. And that's been typically done by, CRBE or whatever, these real estate agents that sort of program these services. They sell real estate. And I think a really great example, a beautiful example in this city of creating a kind of public-private partnership is Rockefeller Center and how it's changed over the last, 3 or 4 years. We worked on the design side of the redevelopment of the lower register, the rink level. But the artfulness of the programming that went into that, so that every customer, every personality, every person, from the tourist to the New Yorker to the office worker, had places to go, services that they need. You know, one woman, incredibly talented programmer, really I see her as an urban planner more than anything, working with the city to kind of create a new vibrant public space for the city. So I think that's the future. More collaboration between the private sector and the city.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you all. This was a great conversation, very insightful. We'll open it up to some questions if anyone has any. Don't all throw them at me at once. Come on, someone. There we go. Right.
Could you guys talk about the sort of evolution of 421A to 485X? And I've seen some articles about the 421A extension. What's going on?
Yeah. I think we're going to have slightly different.
Sure, and you can. So first of all, 421A and 485X only for new construction, 467M conversion. There used to be a predecessor to that called 421G, which was for office conversion in Lower Manhattan. It had no affordability requirement. It was simply a tax abatement from late 90s to 2012, I think. There's sort of this anxiety about the historic buildings in Fried Eye, and so there was a very generous tax abatement program for those conversions. And again, that task force that I talked about in 23 recommended a similar program with an affordability requirement to sort of capture that affordability. So 421A was a steam abatement program for new construction, similar terms, 25% of the units, 75% of the market. There was some options there that you could flex on what the levels were at. That program, and all of these tax abatement programs always have a renewal period that they're set for a particular time, and then they burn off. Projects that have vested in the program. In the case of 421A, the rules there were if you had started foundations and you had made a substantial investment in the property, you were allowed to continue with a deadline after the program expired, which it did. The state legislature chose not to renew that program in a couple of times. It walked that back and gave us a little bit longer. And then expanded again under those terms. And what they did do after a 2-year hiatus, and my boss, the mayor's administration perspective was clearly have seen a dive of production and housing, and production is super important. So you guys have got to figure it out, do some to solve this disconnect between the tax code and finances that is real. And so they went to a room in Albany and locked themselves in and came up with a replacement program which 485 covers new construction. It does have a construction labor requirement for projects of a certain size or higher. So that is a very new term. It is permanently affordable rather than affordability being able to burn off after time. And very different and new than the old program. So that's a different deal. And recognizing that, and recognizing that there were a lot of these vested programs in production in the old program, the governor, with our support, proposed an extension of that program for those vested programs. So if you had started construction prior to 2021, and originally there had been a deadline of 2026, they extended that out to 2031. So there's still a deadline, it's just a lot further. So a lot of those programs that were sort of in limbo because they didn't think that they could finish by the deadline and weren't able to refinance under the new program are going to continue in the old program.
And Rob, did it have the intended effect of reversing that tailspin of development when 421A went away and they were seeing a drop off in development?
So the governor, I was a couple of weeks ago, did an announcement there were about 70,000 units in that sort of world of investing that are now able to plan a production. Some of those are not on the construction site. I drive past a couple of them every now and again, but they have a period of time to finish and deal with the process. A lot of them, it just stopped work because they didn't think that they could make it. So that is a future for the project.
And they had to have their foundation built by a certain point.
They had to have their TCO by 2026 June. So they had a hard stop. And if you're in the middle of your construction process and you get a delay from God knows what, and you miss that June, obviously your lender is behind you.
It's far more than just a foundation.
Right. So there was a lot of anxiety and stress there, and so now they have until 2031 a healthier window, and it has driven a lot of those productions. And there was a process where those vested projects had to inform the city that they were continuing in the program. Would add if there's a caveat that extension was not granted to all of the vested programs. It was for the options that were choosing 100% AMI or less. There were some that were in sort of the higher AMI bands. Politics weren't there for the extension. They're going to have to either move to the lower AMI bands, which they can, or they're going to need to come up with a new program, 45X, which has different finances.
No, I think substantially. Yeah, I think going forward, I don't have too many clients that are stuck in that 421A. I did have a few that were sweating it out, and especially, with the COVID delays and, material supply shortages and labor shortages, but those projects are up and running and completing, and then now the focus for new projects obviously is 485X, whereas 421A, you could also, there was the buying and selling of the tax certificates, so you could build condos. 45X, it's rental, and there's a permanent affordability component, but tremendously better exemption periods than 421A had.
Any other?
Recently, there were some post-1961 office buildings for sale, and the developers wanted to make a contingent on 421 on the city of Yes passing, but some of the sellers would have none. So how many projects, post-1961 buildings, are actually going ahead with conversions that don't necessarily need the Article 1, Chapter 5? Are there any?
Again, I provide some level of confidentiality with the owners who talk to me, particularly if they're in diligence and sort of conducting transactions. There's a rationale that is, they may not have told their remaining tenants that they are seeking condition conversion, and I don't want to be the one to inform their tenants that they called me. So I won't name names. There are some projects that have conducted transactions that have one scenario under City U.S. Housing Opportunity adoption and one scenario without it. So that is very much the thing. It has to pay the architects twice to do it, but there is a small number of projects that are in that world. I think everybody's waiting to see what happens. The good part about a uniform land use review procedure is that it has a deadline. Not be deliberated beyond second week in December or something like that. There's a hard stop. So we will know that very soon and much sooner than the time on submit on the fence. So sit tight.
Anyone else? No? Well, thank you very much again. Roger, thank you
Thank you, guys.
And before everyone leaves, if I could just exchange business cards or information, you never know what type of collaborations we can do. Thank you guys.